Okay, here we are, the fourth Sunday of Lent. It feels like ages ago we were kneeling at the railing, hearing those words of dust with the feel of smeared ash on our foreheads. It has been little more than a month, but it feels like it was a different time altogether. With only one Sunday of Lent remaining before the whiplash of Palm Sunday and the descent into Holy Week, I imagine most of us are really starting to feel the wear of that Lenten road. It came as a relief to come upon the 23rd Psalm this week. 4 weeks in, our Lenten wear and tear needs the balm of this beloved psalm. God's guidance on the path to green pastures and still waters, restoration and fearlessness in the face of death. This is a great moment in Lent to see these words and take them up for the last lap before Holy Week. Especially this year, as COVID-19 stalks the earth. A worldwide pandemic, a viral threat that knows no borders, no boundaries, has met us on this path, and we are stumbling as the information we gather changes and calls for new responses daily. We've certainly felt the urgency and difficulty of staying on our feet in our planning here at Transfig, and that's just a reflection of the haltering steps of our government, our city, and our neighborhoods as we all seek safety and the next right thing. The view from the valley is all we can see. The world of the first century was not unfamiliar with disease. Sickness, for which we've now found cures and vaccines, were able to run rampant through communities in the time of Jesus. One strain of dis-ease that has continued and infects us still today is one that we see in our gospel lesson. The disciples and Jesus encounter a man blind from birth as they walk along. They ask Jesus, "Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind?" The disciples, just like us, want to understand suffering. We want to know why it happens. What's the cause? Who's to blame? We want to be able to understand the equation that results in suffering so we can avoid it, so we can control our exposure and even our experience of it. The question of the disciples, though, is revealing of a larger epidemic. In the first century, the infirmity of the sick, the blind, the afflicted, was viewed as the result of God's disfavor. What everybody knew about God's disfavor at this time was that it was extremely contagious. So this resulted in the social isolation by those who were healthy of those who were sick, whether with leprosy, blindness, a flow of blood, or what have you. So clearly at the heart of the disciples' question is fear. The fear of a God who punishes, who produces suffering and affliction, whose disfavor can be passed by one to another and is plain to see in this blind man who suffered God's righteous judgment and disfavor in darkness his whole life. Indeed, even the very question by the disciples, who sinned, assumes that distance from the love of God and serves to push the beggar further away. Enter Jesus. To answer, he speaks his answer to exactly what they are asking. Why did God do this to him? That's their question. Why did God cause this man the suffering he has endured? Jesus says, neither this man nor his parents sinned. He was blind so that God's works might be revealed in him. Jesus is saying first and foremost that God did not produce this suffering. But he goes on to say two completely unexpected things that are in fact the same thing. He says God will do something with this suffering. And then with his very next words, he says that doing belongs to you. These are his next words. We must work the works of him who sent me. He is saying that God's work of doing something out of suffering is our work. What could God be doing? Calling us into, out of the suffering caused by COVID-19. We've seen the suffering caused by this illness in Italy and Spain. We've seen the empty grocery store shelves and wondered about those who didn't have full pantries to begin with. We are starting to feel the effects of social distancing and the isolation that breeds anxiety, loneliness, and despair, even as we wonder about the single parent down the block who's got her kids this week, the graduation party we were planning in June, the ordination of the new pastor, and the disappointment of your child's canceled birthday party, stores closing, non-essential services that suddenly seem totally essential closing, the threat of the US death toll rising to 2.2 million early this summer, and no real end in sight. There is and will be terrible suffering because of this virus. In our story, Jesus steps into the breach, well within that 6-foot safety distance, and does something radical. The man these disciples have just forearmed with their question is addressed by Jesus, who with spit and dust makes mud and spreads it on the man's eyes, telling him to go wash. In this simple act, Jesus reflects the very first acts of God at the creation of all things. The waters of the pool, the dawning and calling forth of light, and the formation of new life out of dust. It's a remix of the very first song. This is the work of God when it comes to suffering. God doesn't cause it, but sees it and brings light, creating something new outside the reaches of our vision and purview. God creates something we could never have imagined. The social distancing has been the hardest part of all this for me, surprisingly. I've heard stories of terrible things happening here and abroad. But what I've found is that what often appears in the wake of such disasters is the pulling together of a community across borders and boundaries, a lightening of a tightening of relational bounds, and the formation of a common identity. I did not live in New York during 9/11, but I have friends who were there at the time. They each have stories of walking the streets in the early aftermath and having these moments of personal connection with strangers. Eyes meeting as they passed seemed to say, I see you. I see you. Are you okay? Hang in there. We're going to get through this together. And that's New York. New York, that doesn't happen. People are not that way. But honest and open expressions of love and support were everywhere to be found for weeks. But this illness seems to be attacking that kind of community-sustaining contact at its roots. The way we keep COVID-19 from getting worse is by staying away from each other. That is very true, and it makes all this much harder. But God is doing something out of this suffering. God is igniting imagination around how it is we can sustain, love, and support one another, even in the absence of the ability to gather. What are we left with? Even strengthen this community without the ease of physical presence or contact. So in the absence of the ability to gather, what are we left with? An abundance of communication technology and social networking platforms. That's not a bad place to start. The need to be together is greater now than ever. And we need to find ways of doing that keep us safe and mitigate the growing impact of the coronavirus. We need to find new ways to connect, support, join together, gather, and love each other. And we need to lean into the ways we are finding to hold the promise of God's love for us and the freedom we have in that love through Jesus to experiment and try new things, guided ever by the Spirit and the love of God. Jesus, making use of the materials he had at hand, has spit in the dust and covers our eyes with that thick, sticky mud. The Spirit washes our eyes in the waters of baptism, and we see out of the surrounding darkness new paths God calls us to follow. We see anew the work that needs doing, the works of God that is ours to do. And this newfound Spirit-led vision reveals the way as God sweeps us up into God's creative action, making a way where none existed before. So that might have been the best place to end this sermon, but I can't really do that because this is my last Sunday at Transfiguration. After nearly 4 years, the time has come for me to follow where God is calling me next. This is the Sunday I would have gratefully given and received more hugs than should ever be allowed in one day, coronavirus or not. And this hurts, to be stuck in social distancing as I leave this church and this community. My gratitude for the time I've been here, to each of my colleagues on staff, to every adult volunteer, including mentors, confirmation small group leaders, church PTA parents, not to mention all of you confirmands, all you confirmation kids, including peer ministers, and even my Club 56ers. My gratitude is overwhelming, especially without the means to express it beyond these words. All of you and all of those I never had the privilege of working with have shaped me and this youth program in ways I couldn't be more thankful for, and for which I cannot thank you enough. I take heart knowing that brighter days are ahead for this community and for the one about to receive me in Red Lodge, because of God's creative action in the pain and loss we experience daily and throughout the course of our miles and paths. Corona will not get the last word, God assures us. No better words could we hear now than those of the 23rd Psalm. So, if you could humor me this one last time, let's speak or hear it together. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not be in want. The Lord makes me lie down in green pastures and leads me beside still waters. You restore my soul, O Lord. You guide me along right pathways for your name's sake. Though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I shall fear no evil, for you are with me. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me. You prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies. You anoint my head with oil, and my cup is running over. Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life, and I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever. Amen.